The case number was wrong. That's what I noticed first, before anything else about the file made me uneasy. Case number 11400, assigned to me on a Tuesday in March, hand-delivered by a courier I'd never seen before, which itself was unusual, because I knew all three of the couriers our office used and this man was not one of them. He didn't sign in at reception. He didn't speak to anyone. He placed a plain manila envelope on my desk while I was refilling my coffee in the kitchen, and by the time I came back, my colleague, Denise, said a man had come and gone so quietly she'd only registered him because she happened to look up from her screen as he was already turning to leave. She described him as average. Average height. Average build. A face she couldn't quite hold on to even while she was looking at it. I sat down and opened the envelope and read the case number and felt something cold settle into the base of my spine because case numbers in our system follow a structure. The first two digits are the year. The middle digit is the regional office. The final two are the sequential file number for that office in that year. 11 would mean 2011. 4 was the designator for our office in Dayton. 00 was not a valid case number. The sequence starts at 01. There is no 00. There has never been a 00. I should tell you what I do, because it matters. I worked for a private investigative consultancy called Kessler Brandt. We are not the police. We are not federal. We are, in the most stripped-down description, a firm of 11 people who are hired by insurance companies, law firms, and occasionally municipal agencies to look at cases that have been closed unsatisfactorily and determine whether a second analysis might produce something the first one missed. Cold cases, but not always criminal ones. Missing persons. Structural failures where the engineering reports don't match the physical evidence. Medical malpractice reviews where the timelines have internal contradictions. We are people who look at things that have been looked at and find what was overlooked. I was good at this. I need you to understand that without it sounding like arrogance, because what happened with case 11400 doesn't make sense unless you understand that my specific skill, the thing Kessler Brandt hired me for 9 years ago, is an inability to leave contradictions alone. I see the thing that doesn't fit, and I cannot stop seeing it. My ex-wife called it a compulsion. My therapist called it maladaptive pattern recognition. My boss called it billable. I have resolved over 200 cases in 9 years, 17 of which had been open for more than a decade, and 4 of which resulted in criminal convictions that the original investigators had failed to pursue. I don't say this to impress you. I say it because I need you to trust that when I tell you this case was wrong, I am not a person who says that lightly, and I am not a person who fails to find answers. I have never failed to find an answer. Until this. Inside the envelope was a single file, not a case packet, not a dossier with evidentiary chains and witness lists and photographic annexes. Just 6 pages, printed on paper that felt subtly wrong, too heavy, the color slightly too warm, like cream stationery rather than standard copy stock. The printing was clean, uniform, unremarkable. No header, no law firm letterhead, no referring agency. Just the case number at the top of the first page and then a summary that read like someone had written it very carefully to include exactly enough information to get me started and not one word more. The summary described a woman named Elise Marden, age 41, who had been reported missing from her home in Granger, Indiana, on the 8th of November, 2011. Her husband, Thomas Marden, filed the report. The local police investigated for 6 weeks and closed the case as a voluntary disappearance. No signs of foul play. No evidence of financial distress or marital conflict that would indicate flight. No body, no crime, just absence. None of this was unusual. People disappear. The statistics are staggering if you've never looked at them. In any given year, roughly 600,000 people are reported missing in the United States. The vast majority reappear or are found. A smaller number are resolved through remains or evidence. And then there is a remnant, a category that doesn't have a clean name, of people who simply stop being anywhere. Not dead, as far as anyone can prove. Not alive, as far as anyone can find. Just no longer present. The system files them, and time passes, and eventually the file is a piece of paper in a box, and the box is in a room, and the room is in a building that will itself one day be repurposed or demolished. And the absence becomes so ordinary, it stops being a question at all. What made the Marden file unusual was on page 3. Page 3 was a list of 5 names. Under each name was a date and a location. The formatting was identical to the summary. Clean, minimal, no annotations, just names, dates, and towns. Gerald Harwick, the 2nd of June, 2003. Terre Haute, Indiana. Claudia Son, the 19th of August, 2006. Marion, Ohio. David Portillo, the 14th of January, 2009. Muncie, Indiana. Karen Lissel, the 30th of March, 2010. Defiance, Ohio. Elise Marden, the 8th of November, 2011. Granger, Indiana. 5 people, 5 disappearances, spanning 8 years across 2 neighboring states. I had worked pattern cases before. I'd identified 2 serial predation corridors in my career. I knew what geographic clustering looked like, and I knew what temporal spacing suggested, and this list was presenting me with both. The interval between disappearances was narrowing slightly. 3 years, then 3, then 2, then 1, then approximately 1. The geography was bounded, but not tight, ranging across maybe 150 miles of Indiana and western Ohio. This was, on its surface, exactly the kind of thing I was built to work. But something about the list bothered me before I understood why. I read it again. I read it a 3rd time. And then I realized what was wrong, and the cold at the base of my spine moved upward into my shoulders. The dates were wrong. Not wrong as in inaccurate. Wrong as in premature. The file was case number 11400. If the numbering meant 2011, then the file was created in 2011. But the first name on the list, Gerald Harwick, disappeared in 2003. That meant whoever created this file had assembled a pattern that stretched backward 8 years from the most recent disappearance. That's analytical work. That's what my firm does. Someone had already done the work. And then they'd sent it to me as a new case, through a courier no one recognized, with no client listed, no billing instructions, no return address, and a case number that could not exist. I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I started pulling the thread. I checked our system for any record of case 11400. Nothing. I checked the incoming case log. Nothing. I asked our office manager, Ruth, whether anyone had scheduled a courier delivery for that date. She checked and said no. I described the courier to her, and she said she hadn't seen him, which meant he'd come and gone in the window between when Ruth was at lunch and when Denise happened to look up a precise window. Maybe 15 minutes. I decided the file was either a mistake, misdelivered, miscoded, meant for another agency, or it was a test of some kind, an internal quality assurance exercise that our managing partner occasionally ran to evaluate our intake protocols. I sent an email to my boss, Grant Kessler, describing what I'd received and asking if he knew anything about it. He replied in 12 minutes. He did not know anything about it. He asked me to scan the pages and send them to him, which I did. He called me an hour later and asked me to come into his office. Grant is 63. He's been doing this work since before I was born. He built Kessler Brandt from a two-person outfit in 1991 into the most respected independent investigative consultancy between Chicago and Columbus. He does not get unsettled. He does not speculate. He does not waste words. When I sat down across from him, he had the 6 pages printed out and arranged on his desk. He looked at me and said, "The paper stock is wrong." I told him I'd noticed that. He said, "This isn't copy paper. It's not standard weight. It's not anything you'd find in a commercial office." I asked him if he thought it was a hoax. He said he didn't think anything yet. He said what he knew was that no client had engaged us, no billing code had been generated, no one in the office had authorized or logged the delivery, and the case number was structurally impossible. He said that normally he would throw it away and note it as an anomaly. Then he was quiet for a while. He said, "But the names are real." He'd checked. In the hour since I'd sent him the scans, he'd run all 5 names through the National Missing Persons databases and through our proprietary access to law enforcement case files. Every name was real, every date was accurate, every disappearance had been investigated and closed in exactly the manner the file described. Voluntary disappearance, no foul play, no resolution. 5 real people, actually missing, connected by a geographic and temporal pattern that no one in any official capacity had ever publicly linked. Grant looked at me and said, "Someone did real work here." I asked him what he wanted me to do. He said, "I don't know who sent this to you or why, but if these 5 cases are genuinely connected and no one has caught the pattern, then either we have a client who's ahead of law enforcement or we've received something we shouldn't have." He paused. Then he said, "You've got 4 days before the Bellamy deposition. Use them." I used them. The first thing I did was build a proper file. I pulled the original law enforcement reports for all 5 disappearances through our database access. I requested the case closure summaries. I built a timeline and a geographic map. I cross-referenced the 5 individuals looking for commonalities: age, sex, occupation, family structure, criminal history, medical history, social connections. Here is what I found. They had almost nothing in common. Gerald Harrick was a 57-year-old retired machinist from Terre Haute, living alone after a divorce, no children. Claudia Son was a 32-year-old veterinary technician in Marion, married, 2 kids. David Portillo was a 44-year-old high school custodian in Muncie, never married, lived with his mother. Karen Lissel was 28, an office administrator in Defiance, recently moved there from Toledo, no close local ties. And Elise Marden, 41, a part-time bookkeeper in Granger, married, 1 child. No shared employer, no shared social circle, no shared medical provider, no shared church, gym, school, or professional network. The age range was 28 to 57. 3 women and 2 men, 2 in Ohio, 3 in Indiana. Economically, they ranged from lower middle to middle class. There was no obvious vector. This is where most pattern theories die. You think you see a shape, and then you look at the actual data, and the shape dissolves into coincidence. 5 unrelated people, in 2 adjacent states, across 8 years. The geography isn't that tight. Indiana and Ohio, together, have a combined population of nearly 18 million. 5 disappearances across 8 years and 150 miles is barely a cluster, it's noise. But the file had found them. Someone had drawn a line through 5 points of noise and sent that line to me. I kept looking. I shifted from the people to the circumstances. Not who they were, but how they vanished. And this is where I found the second thing that bothered me. Each disappearance had a 48-hour window of ambiguity. Not longer, not shorter. In every case, the missing person was last confirmed present on a specific date, and then was not reported missing until approximately 48 hours later. Gerald Harvick's neighbor saw him getting his mail on a Saturday morning, and his ex-wife called the police on Monday afternoon. Claudia Son dropped her kids at school on a Wednesday, and her husband reported her missing Friday night. David Portillo was at work on a Tuesday, and his mother called the police Thursday evening. Karen Lissel was seen at a gas station on a Sunday, and her landlord called it in Tuesday morning. Elise Marden was home Monday morning, and her husband reported it Wednesday night. 48 hours. 5 times. That could be coincidence. People often aren't missed for a day or two, especially adults who live semi-independent daily lives. But the consistency was peculiar. Not 40 hours, not 60, not 3 days, not next day. Every single time, the gap between last confirmed presence and the missing persons report was within a window of 44 to 52 hours, centered almost perfectly on 48. I am the kind of person who notices this, and I am the kind of person who, having noticed it, cannot stop thinking about it. I made a phone call. I called the Terre Haute Police Department and asked to speak with whoever had been assigned to the Gerald Harwick disappearance in 2003. I was transferred twice and eventually connected to a detective named Ross Halloran, who had retired in 2017 but still did occasional consulting for the department. He remembered the case. He said it was unremarkable. A lonely man who probably decided to start over somewhere. I asked him if anything about the case had struck him as odd. He said no. I asked him about the 48-hour gap. He said that was normal. People aren't milk cartons. You don't notice they're gone until you need them for something. I thanked him and hung up and called Marion, Ohio. The detective who had handled the Claudia Son case was dead. Car accident in 2014. I spoke instead to a records clerk who pulled the file and read me the closure summary. Voluntary disappearance. No evidence of foul play. I asked about the 48 hours. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I explained the gap. She said it wasn't noted in the file. I called Muncie. The detective who'd handled David Portillo's case was still active. Her name was Angela Dane. She was polite but guarded. She said the Portillo case was closed. I told her I was with Kessler Brandt and described the pattern. She went quiet for a while. Then she said something that made me sit up. She said, "Who gave you these names?" I told her I'd received them in an anonymous file. She said, "Portillo's mother called us every month for 3 years. She was convinced someone had taken him. We had nothing. No evidence, no witness, no physical trail. His car was in the driveway. His wallet was on the kitchen table. His shoes were by the door. He was just not in the house anymore. We couldn't find a crime because there was nothing to find." I asked her if she'd ever heard the name Elise Marden or Karen Lissel or any of the others. She said she had not. I asked her about the 48 hours. She went quiet again. Then she said, his mother had dinner with him on Tuesday. She called him Wednesday, and he didn't pick up. She went to his house Thursday morning, and he wasn't there. That's normal. That's how it goes. I said, "Detective Dane, in every case I've found, the gap is 48 hours, 5 cases, 5 times." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want me to tell you?" I said, "I want you to tell me if anything about the Portillo scene was strange, anything that didn't make it into the report, anything you noticed that you didn't have a place to put. She said, I've been a detective for 19 years. Every scene has something that doesn't fit. That's not suspicious. That's reality. Reality doesn't fit. I said, what didn't fit? She said, the dust. I waited. She said, his mother said he hadn't cleaned in weeks. The house was dusty, but the kitchen table where his wallet was clean. Not wiped down, just clean. Like the dust hadn't settled there, like something had been on the table recently enough that the surface was still clear. But there was nothing on it except the wallet, and the wallet was dusty. She stopped. Then she said, I'm not going to tell you that means anything. I noted it and moved on. I'm telling you because you asked. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my desk and thought about dust on a wallet and a clean space where something else had been, and I felt the shape of the thing I was looking at shift, just slightly, into something I didn't recognize. I drove to Granger the next morning. It was a 3-hour drive from Dayton. Granger is a community just west of South Bend. Quiet, residential, the kind of place where people have lawns and garages, and the rhythms of life are seasonal and predictable. I'd gotten Thomas Marden's address from the original police report and confirmed it was still current through a property records check. Thomas Marden opened his front door and looked at me with an expression I have seen many times in this work. It is the expression of someone who has stopped expecting answers but has not stopped wanting them. I showed him my credentials and told him I was reviewing his wife's case. He invited me in without hesitation. People who have been waiting always invite you in. The house was well maintained, clean, quiet. There were photographs of Elise on the mantel and on the wall going up the stairs. She was a small woman, dark-haired, with a smile that looked like it arrived easily and stayed. Their daughter, who would have been 12 in 2011, was now 22. Thomas told me she was at Bordeaux. He said it simply, the way you say something you've held together for a long time. I asked him to walk me through the 8th of November 2011. He said Elise had been home that morning. He'd left for work at 7:15. She was drinking coffee in the kitchen. Their daughter was at school. He called Elise at lunch, and she didn't answer, which wasn't unusual. He came home at 5:30, and she wasn't there. Her car was in the garage. Her phone was on the counter. Her purse was on the hook by the door. He assumed she'd gone for a walk or was at a neighbor's. He made dinner. Their daughter came home from a friend's house at 7. They ate. He called Elise's phone and heard it ring in the kitchen. He called 2 friends. Neither had seen her. He went to bed telling himself she'd gone somewhere and lost track of time. The next morning, she was still gone. He called in sick to work. He drove around the neighborhood. He called the hospitals. He called her mother in Fort Wayne. No one had heard from her. That evening, he called the police. 48 hours. I asked him the question I'd asked Angela Dane. I said, was there anything in the house that was different? Anything that didn't fit? Thomas Marden sat in his living room chair and rubbed his hands on his knees and said, the mirror in the hallway was warm. I asked him to say more. He said there was a mirror in the downstairs hallway, near the back door. A plain rectangular mirror, nothing special. They'd had it since they moved in. On the night Elise didn't come home, he'd walked past it on his way to the back porch to check the yard, and he'd brushed it with his hand, and it was warm. Not hot, warm, the way skin is warm. He said he noticed it and thought the heating vent must be blowing on it, and he didn't think about it again until weeks later, when the police had come and gone and the case was closed, and he was alone in the house, and he walked past the mirror and touched it again, and it was cold. He said, that's not evidence of anything. I know that. I said I understood. He said, But I touched that mirror every day for a year after she disappeared. Every single day. And it was never warm again. I wrote everything down. I drove home. I added the detail to the file. A warm mirror, dust cleared from a table, a wallet coated in a fine layer, but the surface beneath it bright. These were not evidence. These were textures, residues of something that had happened in the space between presence and absence, between the last time someone was seen and the first time someone realized they were gone. 48 hours in every case, as if whatever was happening needed exactly that long. I went to the other sites. Over the next 2 days, I drove to Terre Haute and stood outside Gerald Harwick's old house, which was now owned by a young couple who knew nothing about the previous occupant. I drove to Marion and found that Claudia Son's former house had been demolished in 2019, replaced by a small dental practice. I drove to Defiance and knocked on the door of the apartment building where Karen Lissel had lived. The current tenant let me look around. It was a perfectly ordinary one-bedroom apartment. I didn't know what I was looking for. But in Muncie, I found something. David Portillo's mother, Rosa Portillo, was 81. She still lived in the same house where David had grown up, a quarter mile from the house where David had disappeared. She answered the door slowly, with a cane, and when I told her I was looking into her son's case, she started crying before I finished the sentence. She invited me in and sat me at her kitchen table and told me about her son for 45 minutes. He was quiet. He was kind. He worked hard and didn't complain. He liked birds. He had a pair of binoculars he'd gotten for Christmas in 2007, and he would sit on his back porch in the mornings and watch the cardinals in the elm tree. He had never hurt anyone. He had never been in trouble. He didn't drink. He didn't owe anyone money. There was no reason in the world for him to be gone. Then she said, "Do you want to see his house?" I said yes. She took me there. The house had never been sold. Rosa still owned it. She still paid the property taxes. She still had the key. She unlocked the door and let me in and stood in the doorway while I walked through the rooms of a house that had been empty for 15 years. It was exactly as Detective Dane had described it. Dusty, quiet, wallet on the kitchen table, shoes by the door. The leather of the shoes had cracked and grayed. The wallet was stiff. Everything was covered in a fine, even layer of dust, except for one thing. The kitchen table, where the wallet sat, had a circle of clear space around it. Not large, maybe 18 inches in diameter. The dust had settled everywhere else on the table's surface. I could see it, a uniform gray film, but in this circle, the wood was bare, as if something had been placed there and recently removed. I looked at Rosa. She was watching me. I said, "Has anyone been in this house?" She said, "No one. Not since the police left in 2009. I said, "This dust pattern, this clear space on the table, has it always been like this?" She said, "I don't come in here. I can't. I unlock the door sometimes and stand where I'm standing now, and I look inside. That's all I can do." I looked at the clear circle on the table. I leaned down and looked at it from the side, at an angle, where the light from the window caught the surface. The wood inside the circle wasn't just free of dust. It was a slightly different color, darker, richer, as if the surface inside that circle had been preserved or maintained, or, and I did not like this word, when it entered my mind, nourished. I took photographs. I measured the circle. I left. Driving back to Dayton that night, I called Grant and told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you think the circle is?" I said I didn't know. He said, "If you had to guess." I said, Something was on that table the day David Portillo vanished. Something that isn't there now. And where it sat, the surface is different. Like it left something behind, or like it was pulling something from the wood. I don't know how to say it without sounding like I've lost my mind. Grant said, "You haven't lost your mind. You're just describing something you don't have a framework for yet." I said, "What kind of framework explains a 15-year-old dust-free circle on an untouched table in a house no one has entered?" He didn't answer that. I went home. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the circle. I kept thinking about the warm mirror. I kept counting. 48, 48, 48, 48, 48. And I kept coming back to a question I hadn't been able to answer since the moment the file arrived on my desk. Who sent it to me? The next morning, I found the 6th page. I need to explain this carefully because I know how it sounds. The file had 6 pages. I had read all 6 on the day I received it. I had scanned all 6 and sent them to Grant. The first page was the case summary. Pages 2 through 4 were background on Elise Marden. Page 5 was the list of 5 names. Page 6 was blank. I had noted the blank page when I first reviewed the file and assumed it was a printing error or a separator. I had scanned it along with the others and confirmed it was blank. On the morning after I returned from Muncie, I opened the physical file on my desk, and page 6 was not blank. There was writing on it, the same font, the same clean printing, the same cream-colored stock, a single paragraph. It read, "The pattern you are seeing is correct. The interval is 48 hours. The mechanism is not transit. They did not leave. The space where they were is not empty. You are looking at the residue, not the event. If you want to see the event, go to the next one. It has already started." Below the paragraph was a name, a date, and a location. Martin Hale, the 22nd of March, 2013. Richmond, Indiana. I read it 3 times. Then I picked up the page and turned it over, blank on the back. I held it up to the light. No watermark, no impression, nothing hidden. I brought it to the scanner and scanned it, and the scan showed exactly what I was seeing. The paragraph, the name, the date, the location. I pulled up the scans I had sent to Grant the previous week. I opened the scan of page 6. It was blank. The scan from 5 days ago showed a blank page. The page in my hand showed a paragraph. I called Grant. He pulled up his copies of the scans. Page 6 was blank in his version too. I told him what the page now said. I read it to him verbatim. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "Bring it to me." I walked it into his office. He looked at it under his desk lamp. He touched the paper. He said, "Same stock, same print quality." I said, "It wasn't there 5 days ago." He said, "I know." I said, "Someone came into the office and replaced the page." He looked at me. He said, "When?" "You've had the file on your desk. You've been in and out all week. Denise has been at reception every day." I said, "Then I missed it. I didn't read it carefully enough the first time." He said, "You scanned it. The scan shows blank." We looked at each other. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then Grant said, "The 22nd of March, 2013, Richmond, Indiana. That's 10 days from now." I heard myself breathing. Grant said, "The file is telling you that someone named Martin Hale is going to disappear in 10 days, in Richmond, Indiana." I said, "The file can't tell me anything. It's paper." He said, "Then someone who knows about a planned disappearance is telling you about it in advance, which means they're either involved or they've identified the pattern and they're predicting the next iteration. Either way, this is something we report. I said, report to who? We don't have a client. We don't have an engagement letter. We don't have standing. If I call the Richmond police and say a piece of paper that changed overnight told me someone in their town is going to disappear in 10 days, what do you think happens? Grant didn't answer. He knows what happens. We lose credibility. We become a story someone tells in a briefing room about the private consultants who went off the deep end. He said, "Find Martin Hale." I found Martin Hale. It took me less than an hour. He was 36. He lived alone in a rented house on East Main Street in Richmond, Indiana. He worked at a machine shop. He had no criminal record. He had no social media presence, to speak of a dormant Facebook page with a profile picture from 2010 and no posts. He had never been married. He had one sister in Indianapolis, who he spoke to on the phone approximately once a month. He was, in every demographic particular, exactly the kind of person who could disappear and not be missed for 48 hours. I drove to Richmond. I don't know, even now, what I intended to do when I got there. I think I intended to observe. I think I intended to find Martin Hale, confirm that he existed, establish surveillance, and see whether anything unusual happened as March 22 approached. I think I intended to be professional about it. I checked into a motel on Route 40 at the edge of town on March 15, 7 days before the predicted date. I drove past Martin Hale's house on East Main. It was a small craftsman bungalow with an enclosed front porch and a chain-link fence around the yard. An older pickup truck was in the driveway. The house looked lived in and unremarkable. There were lights on inside. I parked down the block and watched for 2 hours. At 8:40, the lights went off. At 6:15 the next morning, they came on. At 6:50, Martin Hale walked out his front door, got in his truck, and drove to work. I followed him. He drove to a machine shop on Industries Road, parked, went inside. He came out at lunch and ate a sandwich in his truck. He went back inside. He came out at 4:30 and drove home. I watched him for 3 days. His routine was metronomic. Work, home, the grocery store on Wednesday evening, a gas station on Thursday morning. He spoke to no one that I could see outside of his workplace. He received no visitors. He went to bed around 9 and got up around 6. He was a quiet man living a quiet life in a quiet town, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with anything I observed. On the 4th day, March 19, 3 days before the predicted date, I knocked on his door. He opened it. He was exactly average. Average height, average build, brown hair, a face that was pleasant and unmemorable. He looked at me with mild curiosity and said, "Can I help you?" I showed him my credentials and told him I was with an investigative consultancy looking into missing persons patterns in the region. I said his name had come up in a database cross-reference, and I was following up as a precaution. This was a lie, but it was a structured lie designed to explain my presence without causing panic. He invited me in. His house was clean and spare. A couch, a television, a bookshelf with mostly paperbacks, a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs, though I suspected no one ever used the second chair. On the kitchen table was a glass of water and a magazine, and next to the magazine, centered on the table like a display piece, was an object I did not immediately recognize. It was roughly spherical, about the size of a grapefruit. It appeared to be made of glass or crystal, but the surface was not transparent. It was milky, opalescent, with a faint interior luminescence that shifted as I changed my angle of view. It sat on a small wooden stand, like something you'd buy in a gift shop, except that it gave the impression of being very old and very specific. I looked at it, and something in my chest went tight. I said, That's an interesting piece. Where did you get it? Martin looked at the object and smiled. It was a small, private smile. He said, I've always had it. I don't remember where it came from originally. It was in a box of my mother's things after she died. I've had it on the table since I moved here. I said, what is it? He said, I don't know. I like looking at it. It changes in different light. He offered me coffee. I accepted. We sat at the kitchen table, and I asked him general questions about his life, his routines, his neighborhood. He answered everything placidly. He was polite. He was forthcoming. He was exactly the kind of person you forget 5 minutes after meeting them. But I kept looking at the sphere. Something about it, the way the light inside it moved, the way it seemed to have its own slow, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat seen through frosted glass, was pulling at something in my memory. And then I realized what it was. The circle on David Portillo's table. The 18-inch circle of clean, nourished wood in the center of 15 years of dust. The sphere was approximately the size that would produce an 18-inch circle of contact. I set down my coffee. I said, Martin, do you ever move that from the table? He looked at the sphere and then at me, and his expression was the mildest puzzlement. He said, No, why would I? I said, Has it always been in that exact spot? He said, Since I put it there. He paused. It's where it goes. I said, Where it goes. He said, You know how some things just have a place, a spot where they belong? That's its spot. He smiled again. I know that sounds silly. It did not sound silly. It sounded like the way people describe compulsions they don't recognize as compulsions. I left his house. I sat in my car down the block, and I called Grant, and I said, There's an object. I described it. I described the size, the surface, the light inside it. I described the wooden stand. I described the way Martin Hale talked about it. Grant said, An object that matches the residue pattern on the Portillo table. I said, Yes. He said, You need to find out if the other missing persons had one. I started making calls. Thomas Marden in Granger. I asked him if Elise had owned any decorative objects, spheres, crystal, glass, anything unusual that sat on a table or a flat surface. He said no. I described the object specifically. He paused. Then he said, That sounds like the thing from the flea market. I stopped breathing. He said, Elise had bought something at a flea market in Mishawaka a few months before she disappeared. A round, cloudy glass ball on a little wooden stand. She'd thought it was pretty. She'd put it on the kitchen counter near the window. He said after she disappeared, during the police investigation, the object wasn't there. He'd assumed the police had taken it. The police had not logged it in evidence. He'd never thought about it again. I called Rosa Portillo. I described the object. She said yes. David had one. He'd had it for years. She didn't know where he'd gotten it. It sat on his kitchen table. She'd forgotten about it completely. I called the relatives and contacts of the other 3 missing persons. Gerald Harwick's ex-wife remembered a glass bowl she'd seen in his house when she came to collect some things after his disappearance, though she couldn't be sure it was the same object I described. The Defiance apartment manager, who had supervised Karen Lissel's unit after her disappearance, said he'd found a round glass ornament in the unit and thrown it away. Claudia Son's husband didn't answer the phone. 4 out of 5 confirmed, or probable. Each person had possessed an object matching the same description. Spherical, opalescent, grapefruit-sized, on a small stand, placed on a flat surface. In every case where the aftermath could be inspected, the object was either missing after the disappearance or had been discarded by someone who didn't connect it to anything. And Martin Hale had one on his kitchen table right now, and in 3 days, according to a page that had written itself into existence, he was going to disappear. I drove back to the motel and sat on the bed and thought about what I was supposed to do. I was not law enforcement. I had no authority. I had no client, no mandate, no legal basis for any action beyond observation. I could call the police and tell them everything I knew, but everything I knew was a piece of paper that had changed overnight, a pattern of coincidences involving dust and warm mirrors, and a glass ball that 5 ordinary people in 2 states had all owned before vanishing into nothing. No detective in the world would act on that. I could warn Martin Hale. I could go back to his house and tell him that I believed he was in danger and that the object on his table might be connected to his danger. But connected how? What would I tell him? That 4 other people who owned a similar object had disappeared? That a page in a file had predicted his disappearance date? He would think I was insane, and he might not be wrong. Or I could watch. I could sit in my car on East Main Street and wait for March 22 and see what happened. That's what I did. March 20 was normal. Martin went to work. He came home. The lights went on. The lights went off. March 21 was normal. The same routine. I was beginning to doubt everything, the file, the pattern, the sphere, my own judgment. I called Grant and told him I felt like I was losing perspective. He said, "You're not. The names are real. The objects are real. The residue is real. Stay." I stayed. March 22. Martin Hale left for work at 6:50, same as every morning. I followed him to the machine shop. He went inside. He came out at lunch. He ate a sandwich. He went back inside. He came out at 4:30 and drove home. At 5:15, his lights were on. I was parked in my usual spot, 100 yards down the block, with a clear line of sight to his front door and the side window of his kitchen. At 7:40, I saw something I will never adequately describe. The kitchen window was visible from my position. I had watched it every evening. The light inside was the warm yellow of an overhead fixture. Through the window, I could see the edge of the kitchen table and, sometimes, Martin moving past. At 7:40, the light inside the kitchen changed. It did not turn off. It did not flicker. It shifted. The yellow warmth of the overhead fixture was slowly suffused by a cooler, deeper light, a light that had no color I can name, that was not blue and not white and not silver, but was something I had no word for. It rose gradually, like a tide, filling the kitchen window with a luminance that made the ordinary yellow bulb look thin and far away. I got out of my car. I walked toward the house. I was not thinking clearly. I was not thinking at all. I was moving because the light was wrong, and Martin Hale was in there, and in 48 hours no one was going to know he was gone. I reached the fence. I opened the gate. I walked up the concrete path to the enclosed front porch, and I looked through the window into the kitchen, and I saw Martin Hale was sitting at his kitchen table. He was facing the sphere. The sphere was incandescent. The light I'd seen from the street was coming from inside it, pouring outward in slow, undulating waves that moved like something breathing. The light was not reflecting off the walls or the ceiling or the floor. It was moving through them. I could see the wood grain of the table and the paint on the walls and the linoleum on the floor, and the light was not sitting on their surfaces but passing through them, as if the room were becoming less solid. Martin was motionless. His hands were on the table, palms down, on either side of the sphere. His face was turned toward it, and his expression was one of absolute, blank serenity. His eyes were open. He was not blinking. I knocked on the window. He did not react. I went to the front door and tried the handle. Locked. I knocked hard, 3 times. No response from inside. I went back to the window. The light was brighter. The sphere was pulsing visibly, each pulse slightly faster than the one before, and with each pulse, the room seemed less present, less solid, as if the physical space of the kitchen were being diluted. Martin was still sitting in his chair. His hands were still flat on the table. But something was different about his outline. His edges, the line where his body met the air, were soft, not blurred exactly, just soft, as if the boundary between Martin Hale and the room around him was no longer entirely committed to being a boundary. I took out my phone and called 911. I told the dispatcher there was a medical emergency at the address. I said a man was unresponsive. I said I needed someone there immediately. She said a unit was on the way. I looked back through the window. Martin Hale raised his head and looked directly at me. His expression had not changed. He was still serene, but he was looking at me through the window, and the light from the sphere was behind his eyes, not reflected in them but behind them, as if his eyes were a surface and the light was inside his skull, and he opened his mouth and said something I could not hear through the glass. I pressed my ear to the window. He said it again. I still couldn't hear it, but I could read his lips. He said, "It's warm." Then the light contracted. All of it, the entire room full of that impossible luminance, pulled inward toward the sphere, in a single smooth motion, like a breath being drawn. The sphere went dark. The overhead bulb was suddenly the only source of light again, and it felt harsh and thin and wrong, the way a room feels after lightning. Martin Hale was gone. The chair was there. The table was there. The glass of water was there. The magazine was there. The wooden stand was there. The sphere was gone. And where Martin Hale had been sitting, there was nothing. Not a trace. Not a mark. Not a shadow. The chair was pushed in neatly at the table, as if no one had been sitting in it. I stood at the window and stared into an empty kitchen, and felt something inside me come apart very quietly. The police arrived in 6 minutes. I let them in through the back door, which was unlocked. They found nothing. No sign of disturbance. No sign of a struggle. No sign of Martin Hale. His wallet was on the bedroom dresser. His keys were on the hook by the door. His truck was in the driveway. His shoes were on the mat inside the front door. Everything but him. I told the officers I had seen the man through the window, appearing unresponsive, and when I'd gone to the door and come back, he was gone. I did not tell them about the sphere. I did not tell them about the light. I did not tell them about any of it. I could not. I understood, in that moment, why the file had come to me specifically. I understood why no one had connected the 5 disappearances. I understood why the police in every case had closed the file as a voluntary departure. Because what could you say? What could anyone say? There was no evidence of anything. No physical trace. No chemical residue. No marks on the floor. No broken windows. No forced entry. Nothing. Just an absence. A person-shaped space where someone used to be. I drove back to the motel. I sat on the bed. I didn't sleep. I stared at the wall, and I replayed what I had seen through the window until the details started to soften, and I could feel my own mind trying to smooth them over, trying to reclassify the unclassifiable as something with a normal name. The light was a reflection. Martin got up and left through the back door while I was at the front. The sphere was never there. I'm overtired. I'm seeing patterns in noise. I'm a man with a compulsion, and I've let it lead me to a place where I'm inventing things. I could feel my mind trying to do this, and I could feel something else resisting it. Not me. Something in the memory itself. The way Martin's edges had softened. The way the light passed through surfaces instead of resting on them. The way he'd looked at me and said two words that matched the detail Thomas Martin had given me about a hallway mirror 5 years ago and 100 miles away. It's warm. I drove back to Dayton the next morning. I went straight to the office. I opened the file. Page 6 was blank again. The paragraph, the name, the date, the location, all gone. The page was cream-colored and empty, exactly as it had been when I first received the file, exactly as my original scan showed. I checked my scan from the day the paragraph had appeared. It was still there. The scan I had made of the paragraph still showed the text. The physical page did not. I showed Grant. He compared the two scans, the blank original and the text version, and set them side by side on his screen and rubbed his forehead and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Check the other pages." I looked at every page. Pages 1 through 5 were exactly as they had been. The case summary, the background, the list of names. I looked at the list of names. There were 6 names now. Gerald Harwick, Claudia Son, David Portillo, Karen Lissel, Elise Marden, Martin Hale. Martin Hale's name was on the list. His date, the 22nd of March, 2013, and his location, Richmond, Indiana. It was formatted identically to the other 5. It looked like it had always been there. I checked my original scan. 5 names. The scan from the day I received the file showed 5 names. The physical page now showed 6. The file was updating itself. I need to stop here and tell you what I did not do. I did not take the file to anyone outside of Kessler Brandt. I did not contact the FBI. I did not contact a journalist, a scientist, or a university researcher. I did not post anything online. I did not tell anyone. Part of me wants to say this was professionalism, or caution, or legal prudence, but that's not what it was. What it was, what I can admit now, was that I wanted to be the one who solved it. This is the thing about me, the thing my ex-wife saw, and my therapist named, and my boss monetized. When I see a pattern, I cannot let it go, and I cannot let anyone else touch it. It becomes mine. It becomes the only thing in the world that matters. The file had made itself mine, and I had let it. Weeks passed. I worked other cases during the day and came home at night and sat with the file spread across my kitchen table and stared at the 6 names and the 48-hour intervals and the geographic distribution and the spheres and the dust and the warmth and the light, and I looked for the thing I was missing. I ran statistical models on the timing. I mapped the locations and looked for geometric patterns, ley lines, geological features, anything. I researched opalescent glass spheres and found nothing that matched. I researched the wooden stands and found nothing. I researched disappearances involving localized light phenomena and found a handful of fringe accounts, none credible, none matching the specifics. I was stuck. I had seen the thing happen, and I could not explain it. I had all the data points my training had taught me to gather, and they added up to nothing that fit within any framework I possessed. And then, on a Wednesday evening in late April, I came home from the office and sat down at my kitchen table and felt something smooth and cool under my hand. I looked down. On my table, centered perfectly, was a small wooden stand. On the stand was a sphere. It was approximately the size of a grapefruit. Its surface was milky, opalescent, with a faint interior luminescence that shifted as I stared at it. I had never seen it before. I had not purchased it. I had not brought it home. My apartment door was locked. My windows were closed. There was no sign that anyone had entered. It was on my table, as if it had always been there. I stood up. I backed away. I went to the far wall of my kitchen and pressed my back against it and stared at the sphere and waited for my heartbeat to slow down so I could think. The sphere sat on its stand and glowed softly and did not do anything. I could call Grant. I could call the police. I could pick it up and throw it out the window. I could drive it to a university lab and ask someone to analyze it. I could do any number of rational things. I stood against the wall and I looked at the sphere, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that this was the case I could not solve. Not because the evidence was insufficient, not because the pattern was too complex, but because the case was not a problem to be solved. It was an invitation. The file had not been sent to me by a client. It had not been sent by law enforcement. It had not been sent by anyone with an agenda I could identify. The file had been sent to me by the same thing that had taken 6 people. And it had been sent not as a warning, not as a puzzle, not as a game, but as a calling card, a demonstration of what it could do, a resume. It had showed me its work so I would understand what it was, and now it had given me the object so I would understand what was being offered. I walked to the table. I stood over the sphere. The light inside it moved in slow, liquid patterns, and as I watched, the patterns began to settle into something almost recognizable, not a shape, not a word, not an image, but a rhythm. A rhythm I knew. A rhythm I had been counting for weeks in motel rooms and on long drives through Indiana. 48 hours, pulse, pulse, 48 hours, pulse, pulse. The sphere was breathing at the frequency of the pattern. And standing over it, watching it, I felt something I had not felt in years. I felt warm, not physically warm, not the warmth of a blanket or a room, a deeper warmth, located somewhere behind my sternum, radiating outward, the warmth of being recognized, the warmth of being known. I understood then what Martin Hale had felt sitting at his table in the light. I understood why his face had been serene. I understood why none of the missing people had shown signs of struggle, why there was never evidence of force, why every investigation concluded with voluntary departure. Because it was voluntary. Not in the way we mean when we say someone chose to leave. Voluntary in a way that precedes choice. Voluntary, the way breathing is voluntary. Voluntary, the way your heart beats. Voluntary. It was happening at a level beneath decision, beneath thought, beneath the self that chooses. I picked up the sphere. It was warm. The surface was smooth and dry, and it fit in my hands perfectly, as if it had been made for hands exactly my size. And the warmth of it sank through my palms and into my bones, and I held it, and I felt more known than I have ever felt in my life. I put it down. I put it down, and I stepped back, and I was shaking, and I was terrified, and the terror was not that the sphere was dangerous, but that putting it down was the hardest thing I had ever done. The warmth receded the moment I let go, and in its place was a cold that was not physical, a cold that was the specific shape of the absence of being known, and I understood that I would feel that cold for the rest of my life unless I picked it up again. I left my apartment. I got in my car. I drove to Grant's house at 11 o'clock at night and sat in his living room and told him everything. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where is the sphere now?" I said, "On my kitchen table." He said, "And how do you feel?" I said, like I left the most important thing in the world on my kitchen table and drove away from it. He nodded. He said, "That's how they all felt, isn't it? That's why there was no sign of struggle. That's why they didn't fight. They didn't experience it as being taken. They experienced it as going home." I said, "Yes." He said, "Can you not go back?" I said, "I cannot go back tonight. I don't know about tomorrow night or the night after that." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need someone to go to my apartment and remove the sphere." He said, "Will that work?" I said, "It didn't work for the others. Their spheres disappeared with them. But maybe if it's removed before the 48 hours." And then I stopped, because I realized what I was saying. 48 hours. The sphere had appeared on my table on a Wednesday evening. If the pattern held, I would be gone by Friday evening. I had 48 hours, the same as everyone. I looked at Grant and I said, "I have until Friday." He said, "Then we go to your apartment right now, and we get rid of it." We drove to my apartment. We went inside. The sphere was on the table, glowing softly in the dark kitchen. Grant looked at it. He reached for it. I said, "Don't touch it." He looked at me. I said, "I don't know what it does to someone who isn't the intended. I don't know if it—" He said, "It's a glass bowl." I said, "It's not." He got a towel from the bathroom. He wrapped the sphere in the towel and picked it up, and I watched him hold it, and I felt a pain in my chest, so immediate and so precise that I thought I was having a cardiac event. It was loss, pure, raw, neurological loss, as if something I loved had been ripped from my body. Grant carried it out of my apartment. I followed him. He put it in the trunk of his car. He locked the trunk. He looked at me and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Like I'm going to die." He said, "You're not going to die." He drove the sphere to the office. He locked it in the company safe. He told me to sleep at his house. I slept on his couch. I did not sleep. I lay on his couch and stared at the ceiling and felt the absence of the sphere like a missing limb, like a phantom warmth that I could almost still feel if I concentrated hard enough. Thursday passed. I stayed at Grant's house. I did not go to the office. I did not go near the safe. Grant went to work and called me every 2 hours. He said the sphere was in the safe. He said nothing had changed. He said I just had to make it to Saturday. Thursday night, I lay on Grant's couch and the warmth came back. Not from the sphere. The sphere was across town, in a locked safe, in a locked office, but the warmth came back. It rose in my chest like a tide, slow and certain, and it brought with it a knowledge that was not mine, a knowledge that had no words, that was older than words, that said, "You have been seen, you have been measured, you have been found worthy, and the door is open, and the door is always open, and you have only to step through." I sat up in the dark. I was crying, not from fear, from the overwhelming, annihilating tenderness of being chosen by something I could not see or name or understand. It felt like every moment in my life where I had been overlooked, dismissed, reduced to my function, valued only for my output, treated as a tool. Every one of those moments was being acknowledged and apologized for by something that saw me entirely and wanted me specifically and had gone to extraordinary lengths to show me what it could do so that I would trust what it was offering. I got up. I put on my shoes. I picked up my car keys. And then I put them down. I put them down because of David Portillo's mother, because of Rosa Portillo, 81, standing in the doorway of her dead son's house with a cane, crying before I finished my first sentence. Because whatever warmth David had felt, whatever tenderness and recognition and homecoming, his mother had been left standing in a doorway with a key to an empty house for 15 years. I put down the keys, and I sat on the floor of Grant's hallway, and I held my own knees, and I waited. Friday morning, Grant came downstairs and found me on the floor, and helped me up and made me coffee and sat with me. I told him about the warmth coming back. He didn't say I was imagining it. He didn't say it was psychological. He said, "We get through today." Friday afternoon, he called from the office. He said, "The sphere is gone." The safe was locked. The combination hadn't been entered since he'd closed it, but the safe was empty. The towel was still inside, neatly folded. The sphere was not. I felt it. The moment he told me, I felt the warmth spike, and I knew with a certainty that has no rational basis that the sphere was back on my kitchen table, waiting, in its spot. Grant said, "Don't go to your apartment." I said, "I know." Grant said, "Promise me." I said, "I promise." At 6 o'clock Friday evening, 48 hours after the sphere had first appeared, I was sitting in Grant's living room. The warmth was constant now, a radiant pressure behind my ribs. I could feel it pulling, not physically, not like a magnet or a current, more like gravity, like the natural, inevitable tendency of a thing to move toward where it belongs. At 7 o'clock, the warmth peaked. It reached a crescendo that I can only describe as totality, every nerve in my body saturated with the sensation of being known, being wanted, being home, and then it stopped. It just stopped. The warmth vanished. The pull vanished. The knowledge, the tenderness, the vast and patient recognition, all of it, gone, like a hand withdrawing, like a door closing. I sat in Grant's living room and felt the most complete absence I have ever experienced. Not cold, not pain, just nothing. An absence so thorough it had texture. Grant came home at 7:30. He looked at me and said, "What happened?" I said, "It's over." He said, "You're still here." I said, "Yes." He drove me to my apartment. We went inside. The kitchen table was empty. No sphere, no stand, no dust circle, no warmth, nothing. It was gone. Whatever window had opened for me had closed. Whatever invitation had been extended had been withdrawn. I had been given 48 hours, same as everyone, and I had not stepped through, and now the door was shut. I should have felt relief. I should have felt victory. I felt none of those things. I went back to work on Monday. I told Grant I was fine. I closed the Bellamy deposition. I took new cases. I functioned. The file was still in my desk. 6 names, 6 dates, 6 locations. I checked it every morning. The list didn't change. No new names appeared. Page 6 remained blank. The paper still felt too heavy and too warm in color, but it was just paper now. Whatever had animated it, whatever process of self-revision had added Martin Hale's name and predicted his disappearance, had stopped. Months passed. A year, 2 years. I continued to work. I resolved cases. I maintained my record. I was, by every external measure, the same person I had been before case 11400. But I was not the same person. The absence did not fade. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. What I felt after the sphere withdrew was not grief, not exactly, and not depression, not exactly. It was more specific than either. It was the knowledge that I had been offered the only thing I had ever truly wanted, to be fully seen, to be completely known, to belong to something that recognized me down to the molecular level, and I had refused it. I had refused it for a good reason. I had refused it because of Rosa Portillo and Thomas Marden and a 12-year-old girl eating dinner without her mother. I had refused it because whatever the sphere was offering, it took people away from the people who needed them, and I could not participate in that. But the reason didn't fill the space. The reason was correct, and the space was still empty, and I carried both of those truths every day. 3 years after Richmond, on an ordinary Thursday, I came home from work and found a new manila envelope on my kitchen counter. No courier, no sign of entry, just an envelope, same paper stock, same weight, placed on the counter as if it had been there all along. Inside was a single page, one name, one date, one location. The name was mine. The date was 14 days from now. The location was my apartment. I sat down at my kitchen table, in the spot where the sphere had once been, and I read my own name on the cream-colored paper, and I felt the warmth come back, faint, distant, like a voice calling from the far end of a long hallway, but unmistakable. It had come back for me. And here is where I need to tell you the thing I have not yet been honest about. The thing I have been circling around for this entire account. The way I circle around every pattern until I find the piece that breaks it open. I was not the first person to resist. When I went back through the original 5 cases, the deep background, the things that didn't make the police files, the things I found by talking to neighbors and relatives and co-workers, I found that in 2 of the 5 cases, someone close to the missing person had noticed the sphere. Gerald Harwick's neighbor mentioned seeing a glass ball thing on his windowsill a week before he vanished. Karen Lissel's landlord found one in her apartment and threw it away. He threw it away, and she still disappeared. David Portillo's mother had been in his house while the sphere was on his table, and she hadn't disappeared. She'd been present in the same space with it. But it hadn't wanted her. The sphere is specific. It chooses, and once it chooses, removal doesn't stop it. Resistance doesn't stop it. The only question is whether you step through the door voluntarily, in the warmth, in the light, in the full embrace of being known, or whether the 48 hours expire and the door closes and you remain here, in the cold, in the absence, in the permanent knowledge of what you refused. I refused it once. I survived. I remained. But I have lived 3 years in the aftermath of that refusal, and I can tell you with the clarity of someone who has solved over 200 cases and never failed to find an answer, the survival was worse. The page says 14 days. I've told Grant. I've updated my will. I've written letters to the people who matter. I've documented everything in this account, because documentation is what I do, and because someone should know the shape of what's happening even if no one can stop it. I'm not going to resist this time. I want you to understand that this is not despair. This is not a man giving up. I have spent 3 years examining this decision from every angle my mind can produce, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I cannot talk myself out of. The warmth was real. The recognition was real. Whatever is on the other side of that light is something that knows me more completely than any person ever has, and it wants me there, and the cost of refusing is a life spent knowing I was wanted and choosing to be alone. Rosa Portillo stands in her doorway with a key to an empty house. I know. Thomas Marden touches a cold mirror every morning. I know. There is a 12-year-old girl, a 25-year-old woman now, who eats dinner without her mother. I know all of this. But I don't have a Rosa. I don't have a Thomas. The letters I wrote are to colleagues. The will distributes assets to charities. There is no one who will stand in my doorway. So the math is different now. The moral calculus that saved me the first time does not apply the second time, because the second time, the only person who will carry the absence is the person who is already carrying a worse one. 14 days. The page is on my counter. The warmth is in my chest. Faint and patient, and so precisely calibrated to the frequency of my loneliness that I cannot tell where it ends, and I begin. I know what you want me to do. You want me to fight. You want me to call Grant, to lock myself in a room, to let the 48 hours pass again, and survive and keep surviving. You want me to be the protagonist who resists. But here is the truth I have earned by being very, very good at my job. Some cases are not puzzles, some cases are doors, and some doors open only twice. I've solved every case I've ever been given. This one I'm walking into. The sphere will be on my table when I get home tonight. I can already feel it there, sitting in its spot, glowing softly in my dark kitchen, waiting with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and wants only me. And when the light comes, and the room goes soft, and my edges blur, and the warmth fills me so completely that I can't remember what the cold felt like, I will not look out the window. There won't be anyone standing there. There won't be anyone to see me go. And in 48 hours, my wallet will be on the dresser, and my keys will be on the hook, and my shoes will be by the door, and this file will be on the kitchen table, 6 pages, cream-colored stock, with a list of names that is one name longer than it used to be. And the sphere will be somewhere else, on someone else's table, in its spot, waiting to be found by the kind of person who cannot leave a pattern alone.